These pressures were eventually counterweighted by the productivity gains generated by the enlargement of the division of labor with the integration of China and the countries behind the iron curtain in the world markets, the liberalization of trade worldwide and the creation of the WTO, the benefits of an expanded Eurozone and the adoption of the euro. Last but not least, the advancements in information technology. A 20 years period of prosperity had begun, and economic expansion and increasing tax revenues lessen the political cost of adopting relatively more conservative fiscal policies in developed countries. With the regained credibility in their fiscal management, governments started to adopt the inflation target framework. In the US, to this day, inflation targets are not formally adopted. Nevertheless, American monetary policy is guided primarily with a focus on inflation rate. To give you an example, for Greenspan, the Fed has no explicit mandate under the law to try to contain a stock market bubble, and that is, and that it was established that price stability is the central Fed's concern to promote long-term economic growth. Because the adoption of inflation targeting coincides perfectly with the beginning of the 20-year expansion mentioned above, claims have been made that it is a perfect balance between rules and discretion. What remains to be assessed is to what extent the current crisis proved that inflation targeting policy is the best strategy possible for monetary policy, or it proved to be no more than a new dress for the recurrent mistake of credit expansion that in the end caused the crisis. In order to assess that, it's worthwhile revisiting the monetary policies of the early 20s. It's commonly believed that the years between the Great War and the Depression were years in which the monetary excesses provoked by the war were interrupted, that resuming redemption in gold was a signal of a regained monetary stability under the venerable gold standard, and that the wild speculation with equities during the 20s was mainly due to the lack of regulation in the stock markets. The available data tells us a different story. From 1921 to 1929, the total money supply of the US had an increase of $28 billion, or 61.8%. in 8 years. Many mechanisms were used to expand the money supply, given the limitations of the gold exchange standard then in force. The currency in circulation, for instance, stayed fairly constant, around 3.7 billion during the period. The truth is that the entire monetary expansion happened through credit expansion. After all, it was already noted in the 19th century England that under the gold exchange system with the central bank, the anti-inflationary effects of a specie drain mechanisms were not immediately perceived, if ever. In America's Great Depression, Professor Rothbard demonstrates that was the case in the 20s, utilizing the concept of total dollar claims to represent the total money supply on top of gold reserves, as you see here. As shown in this slide, the regime of gold exchange standard of the 20s posed no real limits to monetary expansion. Irving Fisher was in the years of the Great Depression someone who mechanically had believed that since the price level was not rising in the 20s, there was no inflation to worry about and no coming crash, in what words. But the important lesson about the monetary policy before the Great Depression is that the only actual limits to monetary expansion were already the central bank's self-limitations with eyes only on the price levels, anticipating by 60 years the strategy of conducting monetary policy primarily aiming at a certain inflation level and using discretion in the management of the money supply in order to achieve that goal. That is what is now known as inflation targeting. And in face of the supposed Fed success in stabilizing wholesale prices during the late 20s, Professor Fisher welcomed the arrival of an era of continuing prosperity assured by the new policy of managed money, ignoring the mounting investments induced by the inflationary policies in practice. As stated by Rothbard, one of the reasons that most economists of the 20s did not recognize the existence of an inflationary problem was the widespread adoption of a stable price level as the goal and criterion for monetary policy. For Rothbard, the Fed was guided not only by the desire to help the UK or to help farmers, as commonly believed, but also by the fashionable economic theory of a stable price level as the goal of monetary manipulation. Inflation targeting is neither new nor effective. Seen today as the state-of-the-art in monetary policy, it's just a reliable version of the monetary management that became possible once the gold standard was diluted into the gold exchange standard. It's not the objective here to discuss the history of the gold standard, but suffices to say that the era of the international gold standard with a fractional reserves banking system structured as a pyramid with the Bank of England on the top that took form after the Pills Act of 1844 was already a regime with room for monetary management by the central bank, and that the gradual transformation of that system to a system of gold exchange after limited gold exchange, then fixed exchange rates, and finally fiat money with floating exchange rates, just gave more and more room for the exercise of discretionary monetary policy. Taking the fractional reserve system under the umbrella of the Bank of England as our departing point, inflationary credit expansion was possible. First, diminishing the prudent ratio of reserves to assets by the implicit support of the British Crown to the banking system. Later, after the Great War, already under a regime formerly with the central bank, the direct trade and on money substitutes by the leading central banks was a source of inflationary credit expansion worldwide. And finally, since 1973, inflationary expansion of the money supply has been possible by the total discretion central banks have today. All along the way, a nominal anchor, that is a commitment of the monetary authorities to avoid increases in the price level as gauged by a consumer price index, gradually became the only limitation to inflationary expansion and only guide to the exercise of monetary policy. The surprising thing about policies that in essence allow discretionary expansion of the money supply so long as the CPI does not increase more than an accepted rate is that the shortcomings of the theoretical apparatus behind those policies have been known in academic circles for about 80 years now. The intertemporal implications of inflationary changes in the money supply and the limitations imposed by the structure of production for monetary management presented by the Austrian business cycle theory are concepts well known since the early 30s. Still, during the Great Depression and again during the current crisis, many economists were surprised by the effects of inflationary expansion of credit in distorting economic activity and leading to malinvestments that eventually needed to be purged by a recession. As Rothbard said, the fact that general prices were more or less stable during the 20s told most economists that there was no inflationary threat, and therefore the events of the Great Depression caught them completely unaware. Inflation targeting strategies do not prevent inflationary credit expansions and therefore do not prevent cycles of boom and bust immediately associated with them. Moreover, distortions in relative prices produced by inflationary credit expansion, as described by the ABCT, are not easily perceived by price indexes, since they do not include assets in their composition. Increases in the money supply can produce sizable appreciation in certain classes of assets without affecting the price level as measured by general price indexes. Nowadays, it can be affirmed that the long-term inflationary credit expansion under an inflation targeting framework can happen without compromising the achievement of an inflation goal as measured by most price indexes. It was true during the 20s, it has been true since the 90s. However, the fact that an inflationary credit expansion distorts relative prices and provokes economic booms that will eventually go bust remains. Therefore, we may conclude that policies guided solely by targeting a certain price level as measured by the index while allowing discretion to the monetary authorities to pursue growth are an insufficient institutional arrangement for a society that purports to offer a good money as a fair instrument to individuals for enhancing the division of labor, productivity, and prosperity in the long run. Thank you.